you everyone for being here. I'm Suzanne Cattanach. I do know all of you, I think. But anyway, I'm Suzanne Cattanach. I'm David's daughter. It's good to see all of you here. When you have a dad who's 90, you like to it still sucks. I expect this day's coming. Yes, thank you. I'm going to keep a vodka. Anyway, it's still is worse than I thought it was going to be. It's been a tough couple of years for everybody with COVID. And for my dad, COVID didn't really change his life a whole lot because he did everything on Amazon and had people out delivering for years prior to that. And he was pretty content to just keep doing what he was doing. So, although I did start a frenzy with mask buying, and please take one when you leave for future use for flying or something. You know, big supply. He had a fall and hip fracture in 2020. He got through that, and then Ann left us last year. But the good part is that they got to be at home. Fortunately, with great people like Isla and Stephanie to do all the heavy lifting. It was a lot, so we thank them. And also, long-term care insurance. Buy it if you can. And hold on to it, Dave. And in my dad's case, he was calling the shots until literally the last breath. He was in charge. So with that, I just want to mention family who are here today. My dad's brother Mike is here. Oklahoma, he's back there. And my cousin Kelly was sitting next to him. And her dad, Bobby, was my dad's brother. And my son Lee is here. Ann's daughter Lisa is here. Her husband Fred, Lisa Parenteau, her husband Fred Parenteau, her son Ben Metz, and his wife Lindsay, and their daughter Eloise Ann. And Lisa's other son Dan was going to be here. He lives in the UK. He was planning to fly here, but he tested positive for COVID earlier this last weekend. And so he did do a wonderful job putting on a slideshow and all the music and all the editing and things like that he did, so I really appreciate that. There's a guest book. Please sign it. Leave an email and address or some way I can reach you if you don't mind. And put your cell phones on silent if you haven't already. Oh my God, I see a lot of motion. I just really appreciate that everybody's still able to get together. A lot of you I haven't seen in a long time. Because as we get older, we don't have the same party spirit we used to have. So anyway, hopefully everyone wasn't talking to this. So with that, I am going to welcome Mike Rainier up. He's going to play something for us, and he's going to be the first speaker as well. So thank you very much, and thanks for being here.
Well, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I'm not sure how well this is going to go, but we'll see. My name is Mike Rainier, and I had the great honor of working with Dave. I was on a Friday afternoon, I was a Coast Guard officer teaching at the Coast Guard Academy. Dave hired me and told me he needed me right away, so on Monday morning I became a public school educator, and had the great pleasure of working with Dave for about a decade. And after he retired, I sort of made my way to becoming superintendent of schools in three different districts. And of course, Dave would either I would call him or he would call me, and we remained in close contact. And so when Suzanne mentioned that there was going to be the service, I was delighted, and I said, when I think about Dave, I think about a folk song that I played for only about 50 years. My kids really liked it and didn't want to go to sleep until I would play this. And I would, it's a song many of you know about a little boy who grows up and he unfortunately, like most of us, loses his ability to kind of see the magic. And it's in one sense, it's a sad song, but the last time my wife Deb and I, about 10 years ago, we saw Peter, Paul, and Mary play at Mohegan Sun, and they changed the last verse and they add sort of a hope to it. The last verse is in the present tense, that the kids figured it out. Well, when I think about Dave, and I think about his keen intellect, his sharp wit, he was a great friend, but man, I didn't want to be his enemy because he knew how to go after you with words and hilarious words. But when I think about Dave, I thought about this song and I thought, well, isn't that the truth? There are a few people in life who never lose their ability to see the magic. So let me see if I can. I don't play very often in public. This is more of a bedroom. Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea, and frolic in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. And little Jackie Paper of that rascal Puff, and brought him strings and sealing wax and other fancy stuff. Well, together they would travel on a boat with billow sail. Jackie kept the lookout perched on Puff's gigantic tail. And noble kings and princes would bow in ere they came, and chocolates would lower their flag when Puff roared out his name. Puff the magic dragon, if you know it, you can help me a little. I already screwed up that verse there. Getting you to join me, it made me forget. Puff the magic dragon, live by the sea, and frolic in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. And little Jackie Paper loved that rascal Puff, and brought him strings and sealing wax and other fancy stuff. Here's the part when I used to play it, my mom would get teary-eyed. It took me a while to figure out why. Then I had kids and I figured it out. Dragons last forever, not so little girls and boys. Painted wings and giant rings make way for other toys. And one gray night it happened, Jackie Paper came no more. So Puff, that mighty dragon, he ceased his fearless roar. His head was bent in sorrow, green scales fell like rain. Puff no longer went to play along that cherry lane. Without his lifelong friend, Puff could not be brave. So Puff, that mighty dragon, sadly slipped into his cave. But now in the present tense, Puff the magic dragon lives by the sea and frolics in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. And little Jackie Paper still loves that rascal Puff, and brings him strings and sealing wax and other fancy stuff. As I say, when Suzanne asked me to say a few words about my friend and mentor, I began to make a list of qualities, which I suspect many of you have thought about, that they most admired in David. And the obvious qualities rose to the surface. Intelligence, humor, and an incredibility to tell stories. He would often begin, I'm sure many of you will recognize this quality, he would begin a serious discussion, but then he would break off into a kind of like a soliloquy about something perhaps completely unrelated, but hilarious. And Connie Giordano, one of my former colleagues, and I lost another colleague just a couple of months ago, Rick D'Amato. And I spoke to Rick, and he was in hospice care. It was super sad. He was dying from very serious cancer. So I called Dave and I said, our friend was really sick. And he said, well, thanks for telling me. And then the soliloquy started. And he started making these like absurd, memories of funny things. And I was like roaring laughing. And then I said, yeah, but you should probably call this guy because he's probably going to pass away pretty soon. So Dave called him, and I called the guy back, and Dave told the same jokes to him, and had him roaring laughing. So when I say that he broke off to soliloquies, that was sort of an administrative counsel. He'd say something, then he'd make some observation, criticizing somebody. That was sort of hilarious. But anyway, I can make a long list of qualities, but the biggest things that made an impression on me really were his loyalty, integrity, and humanitarian values. Those had a huge impact on me. Clearly, Dave was the most influential person in my life. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. As I say, I served three different school districts as a superintendent of schools, and Dave would call up and talk to me, and constantly probing for information. In fact, when they say probing for information, the word interrogation comes to mind, because he didn't settle for, so tell me what happened, Mike. He'd say, what about this, and what about that, and my back would be against the wall, and then he'd say, okay, and he'd analyze the problems. But as I say, loyalty, for me, what I saw in Dave was loyalty, especially for his beloved wife, Ann. I would visit him, and I would observe what was going on, and it was simply inspiring to me to see what was going on. As I visited him the last couple of years, I was just so moved by his commitment. In terms of integrity, Dave was my trusted mentor, and I reached out to him, as I said, many times in tough situations. He always listened, would try to get the details, would analyze it with that keen mind that he had, and then offer honest advice, whether I sort of figured I wanted to hear something like that or not. He would give me that advice. And then as a former naval officer, you can see some really cool pictures around here, he very much kept that persona. And he was kind of like the tough guy, at least on the surface. But the truth, however, was he was a man who was deeply grounded in his humanitarian values and acted forcefully on his faith. One example comes to mind that shortly after I became principal of Waterford High, we had a terrible racial incident. Students from New London High and Waterford High came to a dance at Waterford High, and there was real violence afterwards, weapons, and really a bad scene. And I was pretty shocked at what had happened. A lot of people were, a lot of kids got hurt. And Dave called me to his office and said, there's a program that is promoting diversity among schools in Connecticut, and I want you to go and reach out to the program and learn what's going on, and then come back and do whatever you can to make sure the kids, all the kids at Waterford High and in the region are treated fairly. And that commitment to equity was something that was just so clear that even with a tough exterior, he wanted to make sure people were treated fairly. And that led me to running diversity workshops for the last 35 years. And after I left Waterford, I went to other places, including a couple of weeks ago, I'm head of a program for New London, Fitch High School, and Ledyard High School. And it really stems from Dave's initiative to encourage me to get involved. So to sum up a career that spanned many decades, started perhaps as a naval officer, but a teacher, a principal, school district leader, graduate school professor, author. The more I thought about his life and the example that he left, the more I realized that his best qualities were best expressed in a poem that I'm sure many of you know by Rudyard Kipling, the poem "If." And as I read it, I'd ask you just to think a little bit about it, because the contrast in many of the qualities that Kipling encourages this young man to embrace, Dave modeled throughout his life. So this is the poem "If." If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired of waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, well, that's right out of page 9. Or watch things that you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it all on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve you long after they're gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, if you can walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything in it, and which is more, you'll be a man and a son. Dave Cattanach lived and modeled all of those qualities, and I am so honored, and thanks Suzanne for allowing me to share some thoughts about my friend and mentor. He was simply a unique, remarkable person, and I thank you for letting me chat.
Uncle Mike is going to say a few words. Mike is a lot younger than my dad was, so when he was born, my dad was already an adult, I think, pretty much an adult. So, a lot of what he knows is family more. So he's going to share a little bit with me today. That's Mike Emerson.
But I did jot some of it down so that I could try to keep track of where I was going. As Suzanne said, my name's Mike Epperson. And some of you guys have already figured out that that's different than Cattanach. So there's got to be a story there, and there is. We're talking about me being just or rather, your dad being basically an adult when I was born. I think the earliest photo that I remember, in which David and I both appeared, I had two older brothers. Bobby, Kelly, in the back, her dad. Bobby is standing on one side, and he's wearing sort of the uniform of the mid-50s teenager, the white t-shirt and blue jeans. On the other side is David, and he's wearing a naval officer's uniform. And then I'm in the middle with my hands up like this, holding their hands. And I think my head came just above their knees at the time. So, at any rate, so that gives you an idea. I was a little bit younger than David. So we didn't grow up in the backyard wrestling with each other. We didn't ever have a fight about whose turn it was to ride the bike or any of those brotherly kinds of things that people do. But, you know, when you're a little kid, you don't quibble if your mom and dad say this is your brother, this is your sister, you know, sure. You know, what do I care what their name is? And so from the very beginning, that was how it was presented. And I'll be honest with you, I bet I was a teenager before it struck me, well, wait a minute, why is his name Cattanach? What's the deal? And so, but it was different in a practical mindset, because we didn't grow up in the same generation exactly. Our relationship was always more like a beloved uncle or uncle's beloved aunt, because my sister was also quite a bit older when I showed up in the family. And you know, that was different, but it was really a sweet deal for the little guy. And I just didn't know at the time how good I had it, but it really made a difference. So as a latecomer in the family, as I mentioned and as Suzanne mentioned, I learned a lot of the details of life that happened before my arrival from the shared stories and the lore that went around in my family. And my favorite is an example of David's humor. And I was sharing this story with Kelly earlier, and she remembers it too, but she remembers a different version. So I'm going to go with my version, and if you want to hear Kelly's, it's different, but not as good as mine, I gotta tell you. So I mentioned my sister Mary Ann. There were 3 kids born in quick succession. It was David, Bobby, and Mary Ann. So when Mary Ann was in high school, she had a date to pick her up at the little house there in Houston, Texas. It was a small frame house. And so the 2 of them, and I don't know who else, I think my mom, maybe my dad, were sitting in the family room, and there was a bathroom right off. And so Dave comes in. Let me check my notes, make sure I'm getting it right. I had to admit, knowing that it was David, Bobby, and my dad in there, I give my sister Mary Ann credit for being brave enough to bring a boy into the household. Because the 3 of them could be rough on something like that. But at any rate, so the door is right off the living room. David goes into the bathroom, closes the door, takes the shower head and turns it and adjusts it maybe. I don't know if it was adjustable, but in my mind it's an adjustable shower head so that it's a concentrated stream, points it at the toilet and turns it on. And he lets it run. And it ran for a surprisingly long amount. So after a bit of time, and the time estimates range from an hour and a half from Mary Ann to 45 seconds or a minute from David, he turns it off, washes his hands loudly, and walks out of the bathroom, sits down, never says a word. And the color of Mary Ann's face was part of the story, and it was at least as red as I don't know, whatever your version of red is. So some years later, my brother's life story took him into the U.S. Well, I guess it was in the U.S. Navy at a very young age, but eventually his life took him out of Texas, where we were growing up. And despite a few trips to Connecticut to see our family's firstborn and then his children, we grew up sort of separately. We were each on different paths. I was a teenager, self-absorbed, obnoxious teenager. Maybe a little redundant to put it like that, but you know what I mean. It was only really after I got to be an adult, that David and I began communicating, and most of it was email. We didn't have a whole lot of phone conversations, some, but not a lot. So those email conversations were delightful because it filled me in now as an adult to hear stories from him about growing up, about my mom, my dad, about his experiences in Pearl Harbor, about his experiences on board a submarine in the South China Sea. And it was just really remarkable to see this whole other side of my brother that you think you know your brother, but there's a lot of things you don't know perhaps, especially when you grow up like we did. It was enlightening and it was a little inspiring too, because he was a very accomplished man. And what I've written down here, I wrote, his quick, often self-deprecating humor was delightful. And it was always a wonderful surprise to discover some shared personal quirk that we attributed to our shared monologues. On occasions, when it couldn't be helped, we would take baby steps into some issues about which we disagreed. And it was typically politics for a bit. We quickly discovered that, yep, our views were different pretty dramatically, and I do think it surprised us both, because I think both of us were in our heads saying, well, how could you think that? You grew up in the same family, but eventually I began to think of us as sort of a redneck Texas mouse and this articulate Connecticut mouse, maybe the country mouse, city mouse. That was just how I saw that part of our relationship. So our tepid political exchanges quickly became exercises in very genteel, understated language. And they always ended with, I love you, brother. We both knew that our shared affections were what was critical here. Far overshadowing any debate or scoring debate points or trying to persuade the other person to modify his perspective. And Dave, I would have never been successful in changing his mind about things. But frankly, I'm really now, I think, more grateful for the disagreements than I am anything else. Because it was the disagreements that kind of pushed both of us to say something like, hey, I love you, brother. Yeah, we're gonna be on different sides of this, but I love you. And I don't know if we would have had the motivation and the boldness to say that. Two grown men talking to each other. How often are you comfortable repeating, well, hey, I love you? And so I feel like today, having given, the opportunity to give and receive that expression of love is what I'm very grateful for. Didn't make it, but thank you guys.
Colleague we're grateful for.
Yeah, we're in the hearing aids.
Oh, that's all right. Well, we're just listening. We're both shouting. How's that?
I have a few new things to say about David, but you're going to also notice in my remarks that there is a pattern to who this man was and how he approached things and how people felt about him. David's administrative career started in 1964 when he was appointed principal of Fields Memorial School in Basra, where he stayed until 1967 and then headed off to the hills of New York to straighten those people out. I didn't succeed him. He was a principal in between for 3 years. But I arrived on the scene, wet behind the ears, 27-year-old newly appointed principal. And during the course of the years that I spent in Basra, there were little things that would bubble up to the surface about David as principal and what he expected and some of the adventures, and I found it very interesting. And then one day in August of 1972, this dapper man appeared in the office at Field School. He was wearing white cotton slacks, a light blue shirt, and a navy jacket. And, as was the fashion at the time, he also wore high-top, floor-shine white shoes. So, even though it wasn't a uniform, he carried himself like it was a uniform. And he wanted to know where Carl Ganan's office was. And Carl was the then superintendent, formerly having been a state rural superintendent. Carl was also a resident of Waterford, and he worked with David in Basra, and then he worked with me, and then Carl, once David got down here, decided he was going to have a public life, and he ran for the Board of Education. And Carl and David were two different personalities, but it was interesting to hear the stories because Carl was a character in and of himself, and I think he survived to 100 and some odd years old, but that was that. So time passed, and I ran into Dixonini and David at various group gatherings for committees and that. David and Dick representing Region 8, where David now was, and by Basra. Well, Basra can wear on you after a while, and I decided after 7 years it was time to look for other employment. And I talked to Dick Zanini, and he said, well, you know, we're looking to make a change up at Gilead Hill School. He said, you might be interested in taking a look at it. So as things went, I went up, I met David, and we had a chat, and he said there were going to be interviews and that. And I said, okay, when do I show up? Then the evening of those interviews, I got a call later on, and it was from David. And he said, I have good news for you, that you've been appointed principal of Gilead Hill School. And he said, but don't get carried away. I don't want you to start asking for ridiculous things. He said, you only won by 1 vote. And he was a pisser. Anyway, I began my work there, and I guess it was beneficial that his office was in my building, but it was also a bit of a burden when you'd be walking by and you'd get, come on in, come on, sit down. And you know, his discussions, and this has got to be true, are as previously described. He didn't give you orders, but damn it, he interrogated and he questioned and want to know not just how's this going or how is A, B, C, and D going about item number 3. And board prep meetings, you would never go in and take your shirt, your jacket off and sit down, because if you had a shirt on like this, following the meeting, you had sweat stains down to your belt buckle. And that office, there were more goddams in that office. And, you know, David knew what the hell he was doing. I mean, he did. And he wanted you to discover what was right. Therefore, all the questions. And then if you didn't quite get that, he had this, it had to be 4 foot by 5 foot poster taped to the back wall behind his desk. And it was a picture of this ferocious lion with the teeth bared, and above was the saying, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil." And then in the print below, "Because I am the meanest son of a bitch in the valley." And that kind of struck me, because this is where he met with board members. This is where he met with his administrators. This is where he met with members of the community. But, you know, that was the mid-70s. You did a lot of stuff that today would be horrifying. This is one I have to slip in because it had nothing to do with David, but it will give you an idea of the freewheeling mid-70s. There was a superintendent in a neighboring town, and I happened to go into his office to deliver some stuff from David, and his secretary's desk was out there, and I said, "Gee, can you give this to Dr. So-and-so?" And she said, "Oh, yes." And she was a fairly young, and I, you know, please excuse me, because I'm out of the 70s too. She was quite attractive. And I looked to see what her name was, and there was the plaque on the desk. Nothing to do with David, nothing to do with Region A, had to do with that other district. Sexretary. Secretary. So that was the era in which we lived. And those meetings in David's office, they're classic. The first few times I thought I had a new first name, which was "Goddamn it." "Goddamn it, Joseph. Goddamn it this. Goddamn it that." But it was, he knew what was going on. And he, in various different ways, imparted that knowledge and really set the course that I would follow as an administrator. I wasn't saying "God damn it" to everybody, but it's all right to lose your cool every now and then. He was a fantastic man. Husband, father, educator, leader in general, mentor, and as so many of you have already shared, a great friend. And a friend that stayed with you over the years. I had only a brief stint from 77 to 83 when these SOBs in Waterford came and took him away from us, but we have always maintained our contact. I want to close my remarks with a poem. And it's a little different from the other things that were read, but it kind of portrays how David stayed in so many of our hearts. "Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But hark, 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 our bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold and dead." O Captain, my Captain, raise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills. For you bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores are crowded. For you they call the swaying mass, your eager faces turning. Dear Captain, dear Father, the arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. Walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. David, that's the way I think most of our insides feel in your past. But you were a man, and you have left a mark that all of us will take. I want to conclude with some nonsense now after that. The root of all evil. I used to go to the seminary. David and I got in more trouble. Together now. This was compadres over our love of Tanqueray and our inability to pass up Johnny Walker. And I remember he attended the Gilead staff party that was at the Continental Club in Glastonbury. And that was in the day of the Troopers, happy hour, Tanqueray on the rocks, twist of lemon, $2, another nickel, you got a second one. Well, I didn't have anything to do with Ram, so I had a good time. He had a Ram graduation to go to. And I got a goddamn with Joseph following that. He got up and he said, cut. He couldn't get the word congratulations. Anyway, he was a great guy to work with, a good friend, I'm sure a wonderful father, and I'm sure, as we've heard from the others in various walks of life, one hell of a mentor. We miss you, David. Oh, and that's mine. That hangs in my study, and it's one I cop. I stole it out of his house, had a copy of it made, and then put it back in his house. And I had him sign it for me, and he's, God damn it. I said, no, you got to put something on there. So he signed it to Commodore. I think he was being honest. God bless him.
For the sake of redundancy's sake, I would say thank you for coming. It means a lot. So pretty far away. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Pick it up. How about now? I don't talk very loud. Alright, I'll just start from the beginning. There was a joke, but I can't do it again. Okay. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. Some of you from pretty far away. It means a lot. I tried to put down some thoughts and things to say, but two things stood out. One, my words don't go as far as David's did, and nothing I put down is very satisfactory for me. And two, thinking tactically about the presentation, I realized I probably wouldn't be able to get through sentence 4. There was 5 or 6, 10 sentences after that. It'd probably be a waste of time if I can go down to be able to get through it. So I think the distillation of what would have been, something similar to just something greater than is, I love him, I'll miss him, but I'm cognizant that 30 years of my life is pretty good. A lot of people don't get that. So I'm grateful for that. And I'm incredibly proud of these guys.
So this is a little impromptu. Fred Parento was his husband. Dave, as you all know, was one of the smartest people I know. He was intimidating. And you're right, he interrogated her. But the funny story, and I don't think anybody ever knows this, but when I asked Lisa to marry me, it was Christmas Eve, 2003 or 4, I can't remember which. Anyway, I asked Dave first, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? You know what he said to me? He says, what are you asking me for? Ask her. I mean, you're right. Dave was somebody that the dedication he had to places now. I've never seen that before. Never have. That was unbelievable. He wanted her home, and he wanted to be at home. And who else would you want to? You know, where you want to live. Dave taught us all a lot, obviously. You know, and I'd like to think I tried to teach him something. And he'd always call me up when I'd go over and he'd say, all right, I got this problem with the computer. And I was like his computer guy. And we'd go at it for hours and hours, and I'd try to fix the thing. And finally, I just got to the point where I'm like, hey, you gotta call Apple. I can tell you right now, there are a lot of Apple geniuses that now speak English a lot better because of Dave. Hours and hours on the phone with Apple. I mean, and and I'm sure there's a bunch of them I would be here if they could. You know, that's the kind of guy he was. I think he was a power of himself. He was a power example in many, many different ways, for many different things, especially for me. Thanks.
I'm just arriving, and many of you don't know who I am, but I was the pastor at Second Congregational Church for several years. And I'm glad, Joe, I didn't see that sign. He never approached me that quite so strongly that way.
Well, we know that he only, well, I can't say only, but he was counting on his involvement with the church to buy him points.
I'm sure he was, but I had the gift of walking with him as the treasurer, and he was pretty precise, and he knew what he was doing. You're right, he did. But he was always very kind and gracious to me, and I have been very grateful. I haven't seen him for many years. We've certainly exchanged emails and things, and I was aware of all that was going on with him. But I wish I'd been here to hear more of the earlier ones. I was in church, but thank you for sharing, and thank you for. I'm glad to see all of those who are here present, because he touched many, many lives, and he took his job seriously, and wanting to see things succeed as best he could. So blessings to you all as you accept his passing, because he did. He touched us.
I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm Kelly Cattanach Courtney. I am the daughter of Bobby, Uncle David's younger brother, and the only person that could put Dad in his place was Uncle David, and we revel in that. I am heavily into genealogy, and I'd find something, I'd find this little nugget, and I'd text him or email him. I'd say, did you know this about Grandpa and Grandma Frisbee? Oh yeah. So I have 2 pages of emails on the story of Grandma and Grandpa Frisbee. Did you know that your father, oh yeah, here's another. So I printed all of these out, and I have this book of his, I don't want to say ramblings, but his stories. And Mike's story, it wasn't the stream of pee in the toilet, it was him slamming the toilet seat down. It would horrify my Aunt Mary Ann. My son, who is Lee's age, has learning differences. I've never had to deal with that before. In elementary school, it was, he'd find me in the corner walking, because I just didn't know what to do. That man kept me off the ledge for 2 years until we got him straightened out. I texted, "Do I do this? What?" Because he's dyslexic, dysgraphic, ADHD. And I was just, the teachers would call, the principal would call and go, "Kelly?" And I go, "Shit." Or then she calls, she goes, "Kelly, nothing's wrong." Because she knows. As soon as I heard that voice, it's like, "Oh God, what has he done?" But that man kept me off the ledge so many times when I would text him and email him with education questions because I didn't know what to do. And he was the godsend to me. When my dad died in 2006, I'm one of 5 daughters. And we waited on Daddy hand and foot. That's just what we did. He didn't expect it, but that's just what we did. He'd come over to my house, he'd sit down, I'd fix his plate and I'd bring it to him. That's what we did. When Daddy died, Uncle David came down and he sat in Daddy's arched rocking chair that no one was allowed to sit in, Daddy. And we would pass David and say, "Do you want?" "No, fine, get it." He'd get up and he'd go get it. But by the time he left, he's sitting in Daddy's chair, we walked past him, he'd go, "Here, can you take this?" And Mother's like, "Ian's gonna kill me when he gets up." But I was lucky enough to come up here a couple years ago. I live in Houston. I was lucky enough to come up here a couple years ago, pre-COVID, to spend some time with him. And when I left him, it was Suzanne. And I was, because right before I left, he kept saying, one more hug. And when I got in the car with Suzanne, I went, "It's the last time I'm going to be seeing." But we stood, somebody even mentioned tonight about the Facebook postings. I said, "Oh yeah, I saw those." And I got it in my email. And then 3 hours later, I got an email saying, "Did you read it?" Yes, I did. But he was just, he was just unbelievable.
I was not prepared to speak. However, since my name was used in vain, I have to defend myself. I'm Dick Zanini. Spent 5 years with David in Region 8. Region 8, which comprised 4 boards of education. There was the elementary board in Marlboro, Hebron, and Andover, and then there was the regional district board. So we had 4 boards of education. That also meant 4 finance boards, 4 selectmen boards, on and on. Then we had the central office committee. Now, that was the coordinating body among the 4 school districts, because Region 8 was an independent school district, 7 through 12. And then we had the local education agency where I met Joe. And that provided inter-district services among 7 or 8 school districts. Hebron, Marlboro, Andover, Region 8, Columbia, Colchester, Oslo, Franklin, Lebanon. And that's where I met Dana Drew. We played golf forever with Dana, from here to Maine. In any case, Region 8 had been under, and all those districts had been under the field services of the State Department of Education, as had your district. The State Department of Education decided to get out of the field service business and force local districts to hire their own superintendents. So David was up in Westmoreland, New York, and wanted to come back to Connecticut. He was hired in the summer of '72. He called Ray Stinchfield up at UConn, who was his major advisor when he earned his PhD. And he told Ray, I just got here. I inherited all this. There's no transition. I'm all by myself. I need help. You got any advice?" So he told him, he gave him my name. I was an ABA. Teaching history, I was a department head, a supervisor, finished my PhD at UConn, and Ray had also been my major advisor. So Ray says, "Call this guy." So with no applications, David called me up. I went over, 1 conversation. He said, "You're hired." "Oh, okay. November 1st, show up." Showed up November 1st. There's no job description, nothing. David says, "Why don't you run personnel?" I said, okay, I'll run personnel. So we've got these 5 districts, whatever it is, elementary teachers, secondary teachers, special ed people, reading consultants. So I take personnel. All the hiring and the interviewing and the contracting, and David didn't want to know anything about it. The only thing he was interested in was working with the principals. He's going to run the principals. I had everything else. A week later he says, Dick, why don't you take over budgeting? Run the budgets. Okay? So that's Beaver, Marlboro, Andover, Region A, and do all the budgets. Couldn't have been 2 weeks later. Dick, what do you know about special ed? Now, there was no special ed coordinators, supervisors at that time. So I took special ed. Got to the end of the year, you got to do all these financial reports to the state. The 002, which is a detailed report of every revenue and every expenditure. By department, that was a twofold process, by object and function. So every dollar had to be accounted for in both categories, and of course it had to mesh at the end. So I worked with Marlboro, Beaver, Andover, Region A, completing all these financial reports. Well, I spent 5 years with Dave. Best education I ever had. As said, highly intelligent, very articulate, had the best analytical mind, insightful mind I've ever encountered. But he was determined. David knew what he wanted, and he wanted the political role. He only dealt with principals and boards of education, or the State Department of Education. Everything else I handled. When I left to go to Wethersfield, and ultimately I retired after 18 years as superintendent of Wethersfield, based on the education I got from David. When I left, they had a reception for me at the Marlboro Inn. Joe must have been there. And everybody took shots at me, and then I got up at the end. And I said to the crowd, I said, you know, I didn't mind doing some of the work. I didn't mind doing most of it. But David, I was doing all the work. But David played a magnificent role. He coached and educated more Board of Education members than in a career than anyone could possibly have done. And he took on all the sensitive issues, all the political issues, all the controversial issues, but permitted me to do all the work. But it was a great education and certainly prepared me for my career at Wethersfield. Thank you.